Considering climate policy and energy policy as something that's fundamental to Australia's economy and really can't be separated from that, although it's only one dimension of good climate policy. If we're any chance of getting to a net zero target and to a responsible 2030 NDC, then we have to really take account of our coal power emissions. And to do so effectively, we need to price the carbon within it and then let a market mechanism deal with the costs. So it doesn't, our advice isn't that government pays coal power to phase down. It's not that the government imposes the costs on the workers and the owners of that capital, but that they acknowledge the costs of carbon within coal power and then figure out a balance of those costs to both the taxpayer but also to the owners of those power plants. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I'm kind of daunted by how many people have given up their Sunday evening to speak with me, but also really excited at the prospect. I have been following the Citizens Climate Lobby for some time. I think when you enter the space of climate and energy policy, you kind of need to know what's happening and have a decent idea of who the key players are. And certainly I think CCL play a really important role engaging the grassroots and in also proposing policy in the policy arena in Canberra. And Marie and I do run into each other every now and then on the circuit, as they say, in one of the cafes in Parliament House, as we both traipse between parliamentary offices, spruiking our policy recommendations. So well done on your engagement in the organisation of the movement. I'm really looking forward to engaging today.
Terrific. Thanks so much for that. So what we'd love you to start with is just a little bit of a story of the Blueprint Institute, its origins, why it exists, why it's important, and what is Blueprint's approach to influencing government on climate and energy policy.
Great, thank you. So I guess the origins in many respects go back to the time that you were speaking about, Marie, when I was working in politics. I worked in the public service. Before that, I was in the Attorney General's Department working on social policy, and then ended up studying a Masters of International Development, working in Julie Bishop's office for 4 years as a policy advisor. Wonderful experience, lots of good people despite the enormous problems, cultural problems in politics. But frankly, I did lament the influence of think tanks on that culture and recognised, as many others have, that there's a lot of think tanks that operate on the extremes of the political spectrum, on the extremes of ideology, and I think they get disproportionate attention in the media. And they get disproportionate attention from one or the other side of politics, depending on where the extremes are. And a small number of think tanks do quality research and really speak to a broader audience, to a more centrist audience. But even they, I think, are very few in number, and frankly some are very good, but in total, I think you can always have more quality research. And you can have work that is framed in a way that's palatable to policymakers themselves. So Blueprint Institute is an attempt to fill that gap and to play those dual roles of producing really high quality research that's evidence-based, it's scientifically informed, and it has a high degree of quality economics and analysis in it. But it's also really conscious of the dynamics that policymakers face and we try to inform ourselves about the world of policymaking, and we produce work and then communicate it in a way that is most likely to get a hearing and most likely to influence good policy outcomes at the end of the day. And I think that is really how you need to be judged in this kind of world. So I guess I've kind of covered the origins of why we exist. I think I've also really covered why it's important. We, as an institute, very broadly, a pro-market institute, certainly not free market. We understand the limits to markets, and the environment and climate change is a very obvious example. But as a broadly pro-market think tank, we have to recognise the value of competition, and I think there's a value in the competition of ideas. And frankly, the more of us who are producing quality work and contesting the ideas and not the ideology or the personalities that we so often get dragged down into, then the better off public policy making in this country is going to be. So that's really why I think Blueprint is absolutely critical. We've had a fantastic reception, as you say, Marie. We've only been around for 12 months. It's been a really quick learning curve, I think, for myself and a lot of the team. But in that time, we've seen a really healthy reception to our work. I think there's a general recognition that more ideas are a good thing in Australia. We don't have the same policy-making ecosystems that you might see in the UK, but in particular in the US. And even the competition, I think, kind of welcomes a new voice in this space. Yeah, that's where we are. And I'm looking forward to discussing first of all, some of the output that we've had over the past few months, but also really where we're heading, in particular on our climate and energy work.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Harry. So maybe we should pick up a little bit on the climate and energy reports that you've done. The two of them that resonate mostly with CCL are Powering the Next Boom and Phasing Down Gracefully. And I think that we sent out some links in some of the information to people on this call for them to have a look at if they haven't already. I just would like to say, as a person who's not an expert in this area, I found them both very accessible reading and understanding. So, you know, congratulations on that point, but perhaps give us a little bit of a sense of what you hope to achieve from those reports, and then looking at what's on the horizon, particularly with reference to the upcoming UN climate conference in November, the sorts of things that you would be likely to be putting out between now and then.
Yeah, so the fundamental purpose of our climate and energy work is to present an evidence-based assessment of Australia's interests in climate policy and some of the reforms required to get us on the right path to a responsible climate target. So we set out in our energy series, which is called Powering the Next Boom, Powering the Next Economic Boom, and already you see that we are considering climate policy and energy policy as something that's fundamental to Australia's economy, and really can't be separated from that, although it's only one dimension of good climate policy. We set out last October with this. We launched the initiative with the question of what is a responsible climate target for Australia, given what's happening with our international partners. And we'd settled since the founding of the organisation early last year on a net zero 2050 target as an essential for Australia. And we did so on a range of grounds, but primarily strategic, ensuring that we're matching the ambition of our key allies and economic and trading partners. Also diplomatic, obviously, and we're already seeing some of the fallout from Australia being left behind in some of those relationships. And then thirdly, economic. And as an economics think tank, that's really front and centre. We wanted to give a fair hearing to what energy and climate reform will mean for Australia's economy. And of course, that encompasses both the costs and benefits to action and inaction, so to really give a voice to both sides of that debate. And the point of our series is to really tackle each of those areas we consider a major barrier for policymakers. So Powering the Next Boom sets the agenda, and we announced this 2050 target actually the week that China announced their 2060 target, which was 2 weeks after Japan and Korea had announced theirs. So we'd already formed on this target. And then within a matter of weeks, even more momentum was behind, a firm net zero 2050 target. The second paper, phasing down gracefully, attends to coal power, which is the low-hanging fruit of our emissions reduction. Really, it acknowledges if we're any chance of getting to a net zero target and to a responsible 2030 NDC, then we have to really take account of our coal power emissions. And to do so effectively, we need to price the carbon within it, and then let a market mechanism deal with the costs. So it doesn't. Our advice isn't that government pays coal power to phase down. It's not that the government imposes the costs on the workers and the owners of that capital, but that they acknowledge the costs of carbon within coal power, and then figure out a balance of those costs to both the taxpayer, but also to the owners of those power plants. So that kind of sets the initial challenge in our electricity grid, and then we've got a series of papers planned between now and COP26 that attend to what we consider to be the remaining key barriers in our energy transition. So Maria, I'd happy to get into that if that's what you want to talk about.
Perhaps if you just give us a brief spotlight or a highlight on those two things without going into too much detail, because we have a couple of more questions to go.
Great, thank you. So I think, so our next two pieces of work really attend to what we consider the main political barriers and the main barriers that policymakers are attending to. So the first is what happens in these coal communities if we are going to meet a reasonable net zero a reasonable 2030 target, and coal power declines in our electricity grid. Equally, what are we going to do as the demand for our coal mining exports continues to decline because of our international partners? And those two issues are quite separate issues, of course. But what we need to do is attend to the communities that are most affected and to those who are going to be negatively impacted. And clearly we've seen over the past few weeks with what's happened in Canberra with the National Party's leadership challenge, we've seen that regional Australia and coal communities in particular have a really disproportionate impact on climate policies adopted at the federal level. And that as a nation and as a movement yourselves, if we don't acknowledge the negative impacts of climate change alongside the many benefits and positives of transitioning our economy, then we're unlikely to bring all Australians with us. So the next piece of work looks at best practice in regional economic diversification. We look at what's happened with a fair transition in many European countries, in Germany and the UK in particular, but also in the United States. And we think about what best practice is and what might apply in regional Australia. The second big piece of upcoming work is polling. We're doing polling at the electorate level, which is very rarely done in Australia, or at least for a public audience. I think there's been some major polls done by the Australian Institute, Lowy Institute and others over recent months, but they tend to do a national sample. And the results, therefore, are easily passed over by policymakers themselves. So we're picking 20 of the electorates of most interest to policymakers and really many which relate to our work on regional economic diversification. And a range of questions will be asked around people's views of the changing climate, their views of what the responsibilities of governments are, both state and federal governments, and really where they see themselves in the coming years and how they want governments to prepare for those changes. So we're hoping to really elicit a broad range of views and to share those with the public, and of course the policymakers who tend to really value a better understanding of their electorates.
Fascinating, fascinating. We really look forward to seeing those reports coming out. So you mentioned before about messaging around the positive and the negative impacts of the negative impacts of climate change and the opportunities in terms of climate action that would resonate with the community. We're particularly interested in hearing what messages you feel have best resonated with parliamentarians when you visited them, because of our common quest for the government to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. So that is our primary focus for the next few months leading up to the UN Climate Conference. So if you could give us your experience on that, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. I mean, it's a really good question, and it's something I think it's something that's really important to ask. I have a lot of conversations with groups who do research in the climate space, and I think there's a general recognition that that collection of organisations has really failed to frame their policy recommendations for more conservative audiences. I think there's been a really, this is over decades. I think there's been a really strong recognition of the science, and then an assumption that people will respond to the science, and also a really thick moralising of the issue, and an attention or an appeal to ethics and to the moral dimensions of it. And I feel as though that messaging works really effectively with some audiences, but not with all audiences. And I think there's more and more data coming out about how ordinary households, however you might want to define that, but how a big chunk of Australians who sit in the centre feel about climate change and climate action, and feel about their own responsibility to contribute in terms of paying or in terms of costs on them. And I think it's always a really important factor for how people consider issues, and it needs to be focused on. So our institute, first and foremost, considers, apart from the science, considers what the economic impacts of reform will be and how those impacts will be felt disproportionately by different areas of the community. And I think you probably need to focus on really consider the audience, consider whether they're a regional audience who might be conscious of some of the economic opportunities, but perhaps not believe the utopian assumptions about millions of jobs or about huge dividends to farmers, or the creation of new industries that will supply, countless jobs to those communities. I think there needs to be a high degree of realism and honesty in those conversations. I feel as though the argument around the costs that we're likely to feel if we don't account for policies that are internationally relevant and aligned with our key partners, then we're likely to see some pretty extreme backlash. And those arguments certainly resonate with a range of stakeholders. And then I think the really important point is just the fact that the world is moving in this direction, and we're likely to be left behind. And we've got the choice of either getting ahead and making the necessary changes at least cost, and that's where carbon pricing, I know we will get to that, carbon pricing and other effective policy can put us in the strongest possible position, so that we're not being dragged kicking and streaming by the international economy, but that we're looking ahead and hedging our bets and ensuring that Australia remains safe and secure, both strategically but also economically. So I really recognise that was a bit of a grab bag, Marie, but it kind of depends on the audience, right?
Yes.
Depends on whether you're talking about speaking with politicians or ministers or public servants or the general public, or a whole range of other stakeholders.
And when it comes to politicians, it also depends a little bit on, where their constituency is too. Is it regional Australia? Is it? So yeah, I take that point. So this is the last question, just letting everybody know this is the last question that I have for Harry. So Rod, if you wouldn't mind just going through some of the questions in the chat to see which ones make sense to come back to Harry with. But yes, let's get to it. Let's get to carbon pricing, because it's something that is very central to the solutions that Citizens Climate Lobby advocates for in their meetings with parliamentarians and also through other avenues. So what are your thoughts about carbon pricing in general? But if you've had a chance to look particularly at the carbon fee and dividend approach, which CCL has now sort of refocused onto the dividend side by naming it as the Australian climate dividend. So we'd be really interested in your thoughts generally on carbon pricing, but specifically on the dividend element of what Citizens Climate Lobby proposes.
Thanks, Murray. Yeah, so carbon pricing makes all the sense in the world. We've been advocating for a carbon price for 9 months now, and we'll continue to do so. In each of our reports, we carve out an appropriately sized section to make the point that in the best case world, in the first best scenario, we'd be pricing carbon and allowing the market to abate at least cost. So I completely understand where you're coming from. We also know Richard Holden very well, as he's one of our strategic counsellors. So I do know his and Rosalind's work and think it's a fantastic solution. It appears to me that it's the only tax neutral carbon pricing that you can do, given that there's both benefits to consumers and also taxes on the emitters. I think it's wonderful. I would say carbon taxes and pricing itself is kind of toxic in political circles. I think both sides, both major parties have decided that it's beyond the realm of possibility in the short term. But of course, I think, so that's apparent. We can kind of talk about that. But carbon prices do exist in our current government systems, right? So we've got a safeguard mechanism that applies a pricing system to Australia's 200 largest emitters and provides the framework for which a greater ambition can be applied, either by expanding to other emitters or by increasing or decreasing the allowances. I think we need to look for solutions that are elegant and that can be applied to across hard to abate sectors. I think pricing is one of the few solutions that is likely to do so efficiently. I think we need to take the heat out of the discussion around carbon pricing and not refer to these things as taxes and refer to them as solutions to price carbon and allow for markets to trade efficiently. And I think we need to be really creative in how these solutions are developed in various sectors. What I'm saying is I think an economy-wide price might be difficult in the short to medium term in this country, but there's a whole range of ways to price within individual sectors.
Well, we look forward to having an ongoing discussion with you and Blueprint Institute on this particular issue. And yes, we also agree that in the short term, our ambition is ambitious, but we're here for the long term. And so we will, we'd love to keep working with you on this. So Harry, we're going to throw now to Rod, who's going to pull up a few of the several questions in the chat and pose those to you to answer for the next 10 minutes.
The questions all look good, by the way. I'm happy to discuss any of them.
Okay, well, it seems thanks a lot, Harry. That was great, and good to hear your thoughts on carbon pricing in particular. But it's great to hear all the good work that you're doing. The first question I thought would be useful for you to answer would be from Shwetank. Climate change science is quite concrete. There are many studies and books that confirm that climate and energy policies make sound economic sense. What are the main blockers that keep policymakers from pressing the go button? I think you partially answered that, but I think there's some more potential there.
Political expediency. I think most policymakers, most MPs want to retain their seats. They probably want to be seen as good members, and they would like to reflect the views of their electorates. I recognise a range on both sides don't well reflect their electorates by not being ambitious enough on climate policy, and I suspect at a certain point there's going to be some kind of backlash to that. We're seeing each year, we're seeing the number of people who want targets and policies to achieve them growing in this country, including in regional Australia. I think there's assumptions around stereotypes of the regions, in particular, that are now outdated, and that we're likely to see significant shifts once members of parliament recognise the reality of those numbers.
Thank you. Peter Sampson points to the federal budget. There was a 48 cents per barrel to be charged to APIA. That's the Australian Petroleum something or other Exploration Association, I think it is, to remediate abandoned oil platform in the Timor Sea. Naturally, well, APIA is strongly objecting. Do you think this charge will go ahead, and could this be a start to getting fossil fuel companies paying for their pollution? It's a tricky one.
Okay, so I really don't know, to be honest with you. That's certainly not my area of expertise. So I'd have to go away and come back to you on that. I would say though, in answer to the question about how our organisation is funded,
yes.
I'd just like to say we don't get any funding from any political party. We don't get any funding from the government. We're completely independent of politics. And we've been lucky to source funding for some major foundations that value public policy and evidence-based research. So our major donor is the Susan McKinnon Foundation, who provide grants to a range of think tanks across the country and really value a high quality public policy debate.
Oh, fabulous. That's good news. Howard draws attention to the urgency of the situation and wonders, does Blueprint have programs to advance public understanding of the urgency of the situation, and particularly the international scene? How can this be stepped up?
Yeah, so we do. Yeah, absolutely do. On two fronts. So we have two papers in development and just deciding on the date of release. One of them really doubles down on a look at the science. We're not a scientific organisation per se, but we can certainly canvass the view of the experts and present it in a reasonable and accessible manner, like we do with economics, but really recognising the science of climate change and the urgency of tipping points. We will be doing that in the next 6 months. And I think we do have a role to play, as all organisations in this space, to balance that urgency and to recognise it in full with the requirement to be, as I talked about before, taking the heat out of the discussion a little bit and not moralising it, recognising the economic, the impacts of the transition, good or bad, on different parts of the country, and attempting to bring communities with us. And that's where our regional economic diversification piece comes in, seeking really to ensure the government's got a plan to help communities transition, because God knows the task for them is going to be incredibly complicated without a coordinated federal approach.
Yeah, for sure. We look forward to that report. Thank you. Next one I'd like you to answer is from Jim Allen. If Australia is vulnerable to carbon border adjustment fees set by trading partners, is an economy-wide carbon price the only really effective counter to that threat?
Okay, so I'm not able to provide like a perfect technical answer to this. I won't call myself an expert, but certainly we've recognised that the threat of carbon border adjustments are very real, and we can either price them into our own economy and tax, effectively apply a tax ourselves, or have the tax applied on us. So certainly we recognise that it's more rational to do the former. But in terms of, I don't think, well, listen, as I said, not expert, but I don't think the statement appears to be a truism to me, given there's a whole range of ways to ensure that our exports are compliant with the standards expected of our trading partners.
Good point, thank you. We have time for one more question, and then I'll pass you back to Marie. From Jeff Paslow, it seems that Russia is making a serious effort to export high-quality thermal coal into Asia. How do you think that will affect our efforts to close down or slow down coal mining and power production in Australia?
So something we try to be really clear about as an organisation, and I think it's really important, is the difference between coal power production in Australia and coal exports.
Yes.
They're two completely different industries. I think 95% different industries, and a small fraction of our coal mining goes into our coal power production. I would say, so it's important to recognise that Australia has at its disposal the means to phase down coal power in this country and meet any of our climate target, or meet any reasonable climate target, but that it's incumbent on other nations to make their own decisions around domestic emissions, as we're seeing with our key trading partners in Asia and elsewhere, and that those decisions will inevitably impact Australia's export market. So yes, I would say Russia's, I actually haven't followed the Russian case that you're referring to, but yes. It would almost certainly have implications. I don't think it's likely to dramatically decrease demand for Australian coal exports in any reasonable time frame, but it certainly will at the margins. And it's just another case of, as the world decreases its demand for fossil fuels, the competition for exports will grow, and there'll be additional pressures on pricing and additional profit and reductions in profits made in Australia, and therefore the jobs available and the degree to which we can rely on the country as an economy and in regional communities on those jobs. So even more of a case for the government to get in the front foot and make the plan for regional communities to diversify and to ensure that there's industries to replace those jobs.
That's great, Harry, and apologies to other questioners who didn't get a chance to hear your answer, but thank you for sharing your thoughts in the chat with us. And great, many thanks to you, to Harry, and back to Marie.
Thanks, Rod. Well, Harry, thanks so much for being on the call this afternoon. I'm fairly confident that you've got a sense of how well informed this group is on these issues and how passionate they are. and perhaps if you didn't know how active people are in terms of engaging with their parliamentarians and the media on these issues. And we're really looking forward to using some of the research that Blueprint Institute has done to further the influence of our own lobbying with parliamentarians, as well as looking forward to the future work that will be coming out as we both increase our efforts to ensure that the government does commit to net zero emissions by 2050 by the time it goes to Glasgow in November. So thanks again for your partnership this afternoon, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks so much, Marie. I really hope we can stay in contact. I'm really supportive of what you're doing and really look forward to hearing more about how you get on with your advocacy. And I would say, if anybody's interested, please do reach out. Interested in what we're up to, please do reach out to me at harry@blueprintinstitute.org.au, or check out our website and subscribe to our policy and our updates.